In the 3rd century AD, church history drops the name Anthony into its pages. Anthony was from Egypt. He started a movement called the Hermits. The Hermits had a brilliant but unworkable idea about temptation. Since society and people provided so many enticements, if you could eliminate them, you could eliminate the temptation by leaving and going off by yourself. So people deserted the cities and went to the desert for the isolation, thinking they could find the release from the temptations that seemed ever so present. But that's when they found a problem. They could get away from the cities. They could get away from other people, but they couldn't get away from themselves, because where they were was the problem. It was as James has told us, that our own desires are our problem, and those were inside of them. They kept thinking the same thoughts, and they kept having the same urges. Because temptation is ever present. It has been ever since the serpent slithered into the garden, and it will be here until you draw your last breath. But how do we meet temptation in such a way to minimize its danger? Do we just fight it out and hope for the best? Or do we just give in and beg for forgiveness? I think there's a better way to be ready for temptation, a way that weaves itself through the warp and woof of our daily existence. Paul drops a single few verses into his first letter to the Corinthians, which provides our lifeline in the surging storms of temptation. And in those verses, he instructs us of 3 things we must heed constantly as we endure the temptations of life. The first comes as a warning. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 11 through 13, takes place in the context of Paul discussing the fall of the Israelites in the desert wanderings. And they provide 2 things for us. One is a warning, and the other is an example. Now, these things happened to them as an example, but they're written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the age has come. These are things that if you trace human history with God, you find yourself walking in their sandals. And so he begins with this warning. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, lest he fall. The problem of our own deception is bothersome. He talks about anyone who thinks. It's what we consider about ourselves. It's what we think about ourselves. It's the assumptions we make about ourselves. And those assumptions are a mirage in the heat that prove we are not what we think we are. And he goes on to say, if you think you stand firm, the word simply means to be stable, to stand on shifting things, like the deck of a ship that's pitching and rolling. And we all believe we're okay, that our feet are planted firmly in what God wants us to do. But that's what Peter thought in Mark chapter 14. When Jesus tells his disciples that on this very night the shepherd will be stricken and the sheep will be taken away, it was Peter who stepped up with great protest. Not me. I'll never, in any possible universe, in any possible way, ever fall away from you. But Jesus pulls him back and he illuminates his thinking some. This very night, you will deny that you even know who I am. Then Paul goes on, lest we fall. See, there's the other part of the deception. We think we stand, but we fall. For Peter, it only took a few short hours in a chilly courtyard to forget who Jesus was. The writer of Proverbs said, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. The pride tells us that we're okay, that we don't have to worry about this problem. We are immune from it. But the truth is, we always have the possibility of falling and stumbling. When my dad was growing older, I remember he started taking several falls. I remember accompanying him with going to the doctor, to the neurologist, and I remember what the neurologist said. He said, we're all about just a twitch away from falling. He said, that's true about the youngest child or the oldest human. He said that it's not that the fall is there, but something catches you first when you're young. And your reflexes are just not as good when you get older. so the falling gets more intense. I remember what he said. Everybody, no matter what their age, is on the verge of falling somehow. And that's so true about temptation. The smallest things trip us up. All it took was a glance from a servant girl in the courtyard for Peter to get tongue-tied and faith-tied at the same time. And so you have to believe you may be in danger. Peter uses the image in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8 of a lion. He says, your adversary, the lion, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. And so his answer is, if that be the case, be sober-minded and watchful. And he pictures the lion crouching in the weeds, waiting for the weak and slow wildebeest to amble along, and then they pounce. Because you see, the devil loves the naive. And so when Peter talks about the image, he says, you need to stay awake like you're a watchman in the night, and you stay awake so that no one gets through to you. And he says, be in your right mind. Be sober. Be sane. And don't be deluded by some of the things you think may or may not happen. But you see, we want to see ourselves in the best light. We can see other people's weaknesses, but for us, our own blind spot is absent to us. And so if you have to, find someone who knows you well and ask them, what's my trouble? Now, they're going to tell you everything you really don't want to hear, but knowing is half the battle. So take seriously your own spiritual imbalance. But the second thing that Paul says in these verses is there is a way, a path with a destination. He says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man, but God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. And with the temptation, he also provides a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. The way of escape is an interesting phrase. I remember when I was a boy, Superman was the best one, I think, was George Reeve. And he was in the old black and white television series, The Adventures of Superman. It comes on some obscure channels in the middle of the night now. I remember watching because I was fascinated. He could walk into a gun battle and the bullets would just bounce off his chest. He'd be on top of a building and he'd jump off and he'd just land easily. I always wonder how many young boys broke arms by getting on top of their houses with a cape closed pinned to their neck. They jump off because we all think we're like that. But this passage is not about being a Superman. It's not God not making us impervious to temptation and evil. Instead, it talks about the way, and the way is not the word we would expect. We would expect the word Exodus, the way out, the same as this title of the second book of the Old Testament. The exit sign to get us out of our mess. If you're in a problem, get out this way. Instead, the word really means the outcome or landing place. How can you get to a spot where you can land? How do you deal with your life so that it becomes a little safer when that moment comes? And so how does God provide this way to land our lives without too much damage? If you look at it in a broad sense, there are a couple of things that come to mind that you see in Scripture repeated over and over again. The first is pretty basic, preparation. We tend to take God as a magician who kind of waves his wand over us and gives us what we need. Even Jesus didn't believe that. Matthew chapter 4, we've read the story of how Jesus encountered the temptation in the deserts. He was tempted because he had human desires. It was proof of who he was as a human being. He felt hunger. As with all of us, he felt the need to prove his importance. And like all of us, he wanted to avoid pain. But each time the temptation, which is very normal in some way, comes, he uses the same word. It is written. The first comes from Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 3. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. The second arises from Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 16. You shall not tempt the Lord your God. And the final is from Deuteronomy 6:13. You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. We sometimes attribute this to Jesus' divinity. But divinity is not temptable. It's only humanity. And here Jesus exposes his complete humanity. He is torn, and yet he knows what to say, how to respond. And so he brings to the moment a lifetime of storing what he needed to have in key times. This is not just about memorizing verses of scripture or reciting the words correctly. Instead, this is this kind of work that puts values deep inside of your heart, and it comes because you spent enough time with God, wrestling with him and dealing with the truth that is drilled in by candlelight nights and odd breaks in life. It gets inside of your very fiber of your being to where when you come, you know what to do, because Jesus shows us you have to be able to spot the deception. See, Jesus had so robed himself in truth that he knew what was already true about life, but he also knew what was false about it. He had a matrix through which he could see what was true and what was false, because the devil presented an interesting proposition. What's wrong with having what you want? But Jesus already had the answers. And he had the answers because he made preparations ahead of time. And we do that in our physical lives, don't we? We want to be ready for the worst. When I was on the Gulf Coast, we prepared for hurricanes. And I remember that I had big pieces of plywood cut and labeled that fit each window precisely the way its own size was. I had put lead anchors in the brick. So within about 10 or 15 minutes of a storm warning, I could have my house ready and prepared. I didn't have to go to the store, buy the lumber, saw it, ruin thousands of saw blades trying to cut through this stuff, and die of heat exhaustion. The preparation was made, so when the storm came, I was ready. This past week it's turned cold in this area, and those who were ready had their furnaces checked beforehand to make sure they were going to run well. And the best time to look for batteries for a flashlight is before the lights go out. And this man who stands temptation well is the prepared man. He stokes his life, and he prepares a reservoir of strength through study, prayer, and purpose. It reminds me of a pilot whose last name was Discrepsey. Discrepsey was a pilot who should have died on an airliner with all of his passengers. He had an interesting habit that he went through. On the way to the airport with his crew in a cab, he would drill them about everything they might do. And every flight, he'd do this, every flight, no matter what. He would say, now, if this happens, where will you look on the instrument panel? When this happens, what will you do? Who's responsible for calling that out? What will you say when that happens? And they would be peppered with questions in the 30-minute ride from the hotel to the airport. Each crew was ready. And they never really had to use it until one day. Qantas Flight 32 took off from Sydney, headed to Singapore, and about the time it got to cruising altitude, one of the inboard engines exploded, throwing shrapnel all over the plane. It cut through hydraulics, sliced through electrical, and left a gaping hole in the fuel tank. Fuel was leaking. The pilot had very little control and very little power. The plane should not have survived, but it landed back in Sydney with no casualties. The reason was you prepare for the moment that it might go terribly wrong. And you prepare your life by doing two things. One is what we said, put God into it. But the other is keep evil out of it. Too many times we flirt with things that create our own problems. We struggle with them. We like to play with them. We like to kind of toy with thoughts about things. It's the worst possible thing you can do. You're cracking open the door that should be locked and bolted. And evil sneaks in so easily. I like what Doug Havishol said about the subject. He said, you cannot play with the animal in you without becoming wholly animal. Play with falsehood without forfeiting your right to truth. Play with cruelty without losing your sensitivity of mind. He who wants to keep his garden tidy does not reserve a plot for weeds. Keep evil out of your life, and you shut the door on the devil. Turn the computer off. End of relationship if that's a problem. drive in a different direction, but part of preparation is not living in the neighborhood where the devil wants to live at the same time. But see, the second part of this way of escape is resistance. Now, it sounds so simple, but truthfully, we have to fight back. It's what Jesus did in his temptation. He used the scripture to fight back. He met the challenge with weapons he had already brought and sharpened, and he was prepared. And he could fight because he was prepared. Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 9, resist him, the devil. Firm in your faith, knowing the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. Resist him. And Peter uses a word that means to stand up against. It's a word that has the attitude hook to it. I will not be intimidated because I am prepared. I am ready. I can stand this. James would echo the same kind of sentiment. James chapter 4, verse 7, he says, submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, uses the same word, and he will flee from you. See, Peter says the same thing as James, but then James adds the point that if you resist, if you stand up against the devil, he will vanish. That's what the word flee means. He just disappears. Because the truth is the devil is a coward who wants an easy mark. He doesn't really want to fight you. He just wants to grab you and go. And so God gives us the ability and the strength, and we should never believe that we're alone in front of the bully of the devil. But armed with what the preparation and the ability to resist comes a grand promise by God. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. He says two things in that passage as part of promise. One is our temptation is not unique. He speaks of that which is manly, which is of man, which is the literal way he says it. When we're tempted, we're really no different than those we read about in the Bible. We're standing there holding fruit like Adam and Eve did. We have a rod in our hand like Moses did when, in frustration, he struck the rock. We're David asking about a woman. We're Peter boasting easily and weeping in defeat. We're John Mark, who's terrified and at night packs his bag and goes back home. And because it's human, others have done this. And because we are human, we know that it won't exceed the human frame that we have. God doesn't let the devil throw extraordinary things at us, but things that are common to all human beings. There's nothing bigger that you're going to get that others have not found at the same time. One of the great graces of God is found in Psalm 103. For he knows our frame. He remembers we are dust. God knows what the limits are. And so he won't throw anything at us that has not been done before that he knows the humans can stand. Which is the second part of the promise. There's a limit. The book of Job, one of the things we saw was when the devil wanted to test Job, God drew a line and said, no more. This is as far as you go. And he doesn't let temptation cross the limit of our ability to withstand. And while we're all alike in our humanity, we're all different in our spirits. There are some who are weaker and some who are stronger. But God doesn't have a one-size-fits-all approach to life. And our temptation is not overwhelming, even though we may think it is, because God knows what our limits are, and he draws the line before the devil can cross them. It's something we need to remember because it's our pressure relief valve in the midst of temptation. See, both of those say the same thing. God, in his grace, cares for us, even in the worst of times. He knows what will make us grow and what will cause us danger. Remember, temptation has a purpose, to test our faith and to strengthen our faith. And God lets us experience the correct level, then pulls the devil back. Temptation, as we have seen in this series, is a strange, perplexing part of the human and the Christian experience. It's unpleasant, but it's born of our own desires, which are manipulated by the deceiver. And when we encounter it, we either grow stronger through endurance or weaker through surrender. So, what do we do in life's tempting areas? When caught in the storm, what's necessary? First, you need to look at yourself. We all do. Have you put in the time preparing your life? Are you doing that today? Have you been playing with sin and thereby created a weakness in your life which allows the devil to enter into your life? What are your weaknesses? Do you know what they are? Because if you don't know, you'll be exploited at that moment. Do you think you're immune from the struggle with sin? Because unless we look in the mirror and see more than the face of the reflection, we place ourselves in danger. But the second is to look to God. Those who are successful in temptation encounter the battle with someone beside them. God provides the endpoint, the resources, and the moment to prepare and plan. He cares for us. He's not like Jonathan Edwards, the Puritan preacher, who presented God as an angry God dangling us over the fires of hell. Instead, he's a loving God who reaches out for us to take us to heaven. Perhaps it is best in our struggle with temptation to remember the words of D.H. Grover in The Race. Quit. Give up. You're beaten. They shout at me and plead. There's just too much against you now. This time you can't succeed. As I start to hang my head in front of failure's face, my downward fall is broken by the memory of a race. And hope refills my weakened will as I recall the sacred scene, for just the thought of that short race rejuvenates my being. A children's race, young boys, young men. Now I remember well, excitement, sure, but also fear. It wasn't hard to tell. They all lined up so full of hope. Each thought to win the race, or tie for first, or if not for that, at least take second place. And fathers watched from off the side, each cheering for his son. Each boy hoped to show his dad that he'd be the one. The whistle blew and off they sped, as if they were on fire. To win, to be the hero there, was each boy's deep desire. And one boy in particular, whose dad was in the crowd, was running near the lead and thought, my dad will be so proud. But as he speeded down the field, across the shallow dip, the little boy who thought to win lost his step and slipped. Trying hard to catch himself, his arms flew out of brace, and mid the laughter of the crowd, he fell flat on his face. So down he fell, and with him hope. He couldn't win it now. Embarrassed, sad, he only wished to disappear somehow. But as he fell, his dad stood up and showed his loving face, which the boy so clearly said, get up and win the race. He quickly rose, no damage done, behind a bit, that's all, and he ran with all his might and might make it up for the fall. So anxious to restore himself, to catch up and to win, his mind went faster than his legs. He slipped and he fell again. He wished he had quit before with only one disgrace. I'm hopeless as a runner now. I should just give up the race. But in the laughing crowd, he searched and found his father's face, that steady look that said again, get up and win the race. So he jumped up to try again, 10 yards behind the last. If I'm to gain those yards, he thought, I've got to run real fast. And everything exerting he had, he gained 8 or 10. But in trying hard to catch the lead, he slipped and fell again. Defeat, he lay there silently. A tear dropped from his eyes. There's no sense running more. 3 strikes, I'm out. Why try? The will to rise had disappeared. All hope had fled away. So far behind, so error-prone, a loser all the way. I've lost, so what's the use, he thought. I'll live with my disgrace. But then he thought about his dad, who soon he'd have to face. Get up, an echo sounded. Get up and take your place. You weren't meant for failure here. Get up and win the race. With borrowed will, get up, it said. You haven't lost it all. For winning is no more than this, to rise each time you fall. So he rose to win one more time, and with a new commit, he resolved to win or lose, but at least he wouldn't quit. So far behind the others now, the most he'd ever been, still he gave it all he had and ran as though to win. 3 times he had fallen, stumbling, 3 times he rose again. Too far behind to hope to win, he still ran to the end. They cheered the winning runner as he crossed the line, first place, head high and proud and happy, no falling, no disgrace. But when the fallen youngster crossed the line, last place, the crowd gave him the greatest cheer for finishing the race. And even though he came in last, with head bowed low, unproud, you would have thought he won the race to listen to the crowd. And to his dad, he sadly said, I didn't do so well. What? To me you won, his father said, because you rose each time you fell. And when things seemed dark and hard and difficult to face, the memory of that little boy helps me in my race. For all of life is like that race, with ups and downs and all. And all you have to do to win is rise each time you fall. Quit, give up, you're beaten. They still shout in my face. But then I hear another voice that says, get up and win the race. Remember, every time you're down, the Lord will help you up, and you can try again. And He'll always help you in the way. Thank you for joining me, and next week we'll be back with another series of lessons.